All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating. We're going to crack open the case file on the perfect murder.
Ooh, exciting.
You know, the kind of crime that just vanishes without a trace.
Right.
Leaves even the best detectives scratching their heads. But, you know, here in the real world, far away from all the Hollywood glitz and glam, is that even possible? Like, can someone really pull off a murder that's completely undetectable?
Yeah.
That's what we're here to figure out.
I like it. Sounds like a good deep dive.
Yeah, I think so.
Let's do it.
We're going to be taking a look at an excerpt from Zak Martin's book, The Perfect Murder.
Okay.
And we're going to try to sift through the facts and the fiction, you know, separate what's real and what's just a product of our overactive imaginations. So are we dealing with, like, criminal masterminds out there? Or is the truth about murder a little less, a little less glamorous than we might think?
Well, it's interesting you say that. So I think one of the things that this whole concept, the perfect murder, does is it really makes us kind of romanticize these figures, these criminal masterminds.
Yeah, for sure.
We see them in the movies,
Oh, yeah.
You read about them in books, these incredibly intelligent, cunning figures who are always 10 steps ahead. But the fascinating thing is, when we look at the real world, there's often a huge disconnect between that fantasy and the, kind of the gritty reality of most crimes.
It's true. Martin, the author of The Perfect Murder, really pulls the curtain back on that whole perception,
Yeah.
He argues that most crimes, in reality, are super messy. They're unplanned, impulsive acts, often committed by people who, frankly, aren't very strategic or intelligent. Think of it this way. Like the junkie who, robs a convenience store just destined to get their next fix.
Right.
Or a heated argument, you know how those can be.
Oh, yeah.
It escalates, and then suddenly, bam, you've got a deadly domestic dispute. It's not exactly, Professor Moriarty levels of meticulous planning. It's not that intricate web of deceit that we see in, Sherlock Holmes or something like that.
No, not at all. And that's where I think one of the most striking statistics that Martin brings up is so powerful. He says that almost 50% of convicted criminals end up back behind bars.
Wow.
Within a year of being released. So what does that tell us? That it's not necessarily about a, moral failing or a conscious decision to break the law. It's often about this, impulsive behavior, this lack of thinking through the consequences of your actions.
It really makes you think about the psychology behind it all,
That's it.
Because if we're kind of throwing out the idea of these meticulous criminal masterminds, does that then mean, like, planning a murder is pointless? Or are there still people out there who try to pull off these intricate, undetectable crimes?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting, I think. Because the paradox is that if a murder were truly, truly perfect, we would never know it happened.
Right.
It would just blend seamlessly into the background noise of everyday life. It might be mistaken for an accident, for a natural death, and we would be none the wiser.
Mm.
So the cases that we do know about, the ones that seem perfect, at first glance, those often unravel because of the most unexpected and sometimes even mundane things.
Yeah. Martin highlights some really chilling examples of this in his book. Like, think about some of the most notorious serial killers. Peter Sutcliffe, Ted Bundy, even Joel Rifkin. These were individuals who terrorized communities, seemingly invisible to law enforcement, and yet, what brought them down? Sometimes the simplest things, like routine traffic stops.
It's amazing, right? You think about all the intricate planning, all the steps they took to avoid detection, and then they get tripped up by a broken taillight or an expired registration.
Right. And it just goes to show, I think, that no matter how carefully you craft a plan, there's always this element of chance, this unpredictability to life that you just can't account for. It's like the universe has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them.
Absolutely. And I think, on top of that, there's just the sheer weight of trying to control every single variable. I mean, can you imagine trying to orchestrate an event like this where you have to erase your presence from the world, essentially?
It's mind-boggling.
It is.
Wow.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And Martin, really paints a picture of this. He talks about someone trying to completely disappear themselves, if only for a short period of time, just to pull off this crime.
Right.
They have to dodge CCTV cameras like they're ninjas.
Right.
They have to vanish from the digital world.
Right.
No phone records, no text messages, no online purchases. And of course, above all, no DNA evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, it's like trying to slip through the cracks of reality itself.
Yeah, exactly.
And even then, the tiniest slip-up, like we said, can be their undoing. I mean, remember Martin mentions this one detail, this idea of a single eyelash being enough to land someone behind bars. It just shows how incredibly precise forensic science has become. We're not dealing with just fingerprints anymore. We're talking DNA analysis, fiber analysis.
And even something called vibrational spectroscopy.
Wait, hold on. Vibrational what?
Vibrational spectroscopy.
I'm not sure I've ever heard of that one. What is that exactly?
So imagine this. You shine a very specific type of light on a piece of evidence, say a tiny speck of dirt or a drop of paint. The molecules in that material, they're going to vibrate in a very unique way. And that creates a kind of fingerprint that can be analyzed. So investigators can use this to identify the precise composition of a substance and potentially link it back to its source.
So it's like having this, microscopic detective working on your case.
It is. It really is.
That's amazing. So we've got all of this tech, right? DNA, fiber analysis, vibrational spectroscopy, satellite photos that can track movement, pinpoint locations.
A lot.
It feels like we're living in a world where it's almost impossible to truly disappear, let alone get away with something as serious as murder. But then here's the counter argument. If all of this tech is so effective at catching criminals, why are crime rates in general still falling? Is it all because of these advancements in technology? Or are there other factors at play, societal changes, economic trends, all of that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something that criminologists are still debating and trying to fully understand. There's no doubt that the increased surveillance, the sheer amount of data that we generate in our daily lives.
It's massive.
It's massive. And it does play a role, right? But there are other pieces to this puzzle as well. Like you said, societal shifts, economic trends, even changes in policing strategies can all contribute to these overall crime rate trends.
So it's not a simple answer, is it?
Not at all. It's complex.
It's this big web of interconnected things.
Exactly.
So while modern forensics definitely makes it way harder to pull off the perfect murder, it's not the only factor influencing these broader crime trends.
You got it.
Okay, deep divers, we're just getting started here. Buckle up, because we're about to go even deeper into this whole concept. So we've established that planning the perfect murder is incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah. But is it truly impossible? I mean, what would it really take to do this? What are the hurdles that someone trying to pull this off would have to overcome?
We got to find out.
And can you truly outsource the risk? Like hire a hitman and wash your hands of the whole thing? Or does that just create a whole other set of problems?
Exactly. That's what we're about to get into. We'll be right back after a quick break.
So we've seen how difficult pulling off a truly perfect murder is, even for the most meticulous planner. But let's shift gears for a moment and imagine we're stepping into the shoes of someone actually contemplating this. Let's say they decided premeditation is the way to go, like really trying to think this through. What would that even look like? How do you orchestrate a crime so seamlessly that it leaves absolutely no trace, no suspicion, no reason for anyone to even think something's wrong?
It sounds like a logistical nightmare, honestly. I mean, we already talked about how they'd have to become practically invisible, right? Dodging CCTV cameras like they're in some spy movie, scrubbing their digital footprint, not leaving a single shred of DNA behind. It's like trying to disappear from reality itself.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And even then, like we said before, one tiny slip up, one overlooked detail, and the whole house of cards could come tumbling down. Remember that eyelash we talked about? It really highlights just how sensitive and meticulous forensics has become.
Right. Right. It makes you realize it's not just about fingerprints anymore. We're talking about this whole other level of analysis, right? Like fibers, paint particles, even the way molecules vibrate under light with that, what was it called? Vibrational spectroscopy.
Yeah, vibrational spectroscopy is mind-blowing stuff.
Okay, so back to our hypothetical mastermind, right? They're sitting there trying to plan this perfect crime, knowing all of this, knowing just how much investigators can find. Wouldn't they eventually hit a wall, realize that it's just too risky to try to do this all alone?
That's where the idea of outsourcing the risk comes in, right? The classic hire a hitman scenario. Seems like a pretty simple solution on the surface. You delegate the dirty work, maintain a nice, clean alibi. What could go wrong? But as Martin points out in his book, The World of Contract Killing, well, it's often more myth than reality.
Yeah, Hollywood has definitely romanticized the image of the hitman, right? We picture these suave, highly trained professionals who just slip in, do the job, and vanish without a trace.
Exactly. But the reality is that most hitmen are far from that romanticized ideal. They're opportunistic criminals, often driven by, immediate gain, a quick payday, not some code of honor or anything. They make mistakes, they leave clues, and they're definitely not immune to getting caught themselves.
And so you're relying on someone like that to keep your secret, to not turn on you if things go south. That seems like a risky gamble to me.
It's a gamble with incredibly high stakes. And think about it. What's to stop this hitman from, I don't know, coming back later, demanding more money, threatening to expose everything if you don't pay up?
Right. Criminals aren't exactly known for their loyalty or their discretion, are they?
Not really. So you're not only depending on their competence, you're also depending on their silence, which is a pretty shaky foundation to build your perfect plan on.
Definitely seems like a recipe for disaster. But it makes you wonder, what kind of person would even think that hiring a hitman is a foolproof solution? Do they really believe in this whole facade of loyalty and professionalism? Or are they just so desperate that they're willing to ignore the obvious risks?
It's a fascinating psychological question, and it brings up another point that Martin makes, one that's, well, it's a bit unsettling, to be honest. He says that statistically, the person most likely to take your life is someone you already know. In fact, over a third of all murders are committed by family members or close acquaintances.
Wow, that's heavier than I was expecting.
Yeah.
But I guess when you think about it, it does make a certain kind of sense, doesn't it? You already have that inherent trust, that familiarity, that makes it easier to manipulate situations, to exploit vulnerabilities.
Exactly. Think about it.
Yeah.
You have inside knowledge of the victim's routines, their habits, their weaknesses. You have easy access to their home, their belongings. And initially, you're much less likely to be viewed as a suspect. So it becomes easier to stage a scenario, right? Make it look like an accident, maybe even a suicide. The perfect murder in these cases isn't necessarily about elaborate schemes or, super complicated techniques. It's about blending into the background, exploiting those pre-existing relationships, those vulnerabilities, to make the crime seem almost natural.
It's terrifying, honestly. It really blurs the line between, genuine misfortune and intentional harm. How can investigators even begin to untangle something like that, especially when it's so carefully disguised within the context of a close relationship?
That's where the expertise and the experience of law enforcement come in. They're trained to look for those inconsistencies, those subtle clues that don't quite add up to the presented narrative. It's like piecing together a puzzle where some of the pieces are intentionally missing or, even intentionally altered.
It sounds incredibly challenging. And it makes you wonder how many crimes might slip through the cracks simply because they seem too ordinary, too believable. It's like if it fits within our expectations of what's normal, we're less likely to question it, right?
Right. And it's actually something that Martin brings up in his book. He says that accidental deaths are so common, so statistically frequent, that they often don't receive the same level of scrutiny as cases that are very clearly homicides.
That's a chilling thought. It's like there's this blind spot, this potential for a cleverly disguised murder to be completely overlooked just because it fits within the expected patterns of everyday life.
It's a vulnerability that someone looking to commit the perfect murder could definitely try to exploit.
It's a scary thought. But what about the role of technology in all of this? Specifically DNA evidence. We're constantly hearing about how DNA is this ultimate forensic tool, the irrefutable proof that can solve even the coldest of cases. Does that hold up in the real world? Is it really that foolproof?
DNA analysis has undeniably revolutionized the world of forensics.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing cold cases from decades ago being solved thanks to DNA matching, bringing a sense of justice and closure to families who had lost all hope. But like any tool, it has its limitations.
I'm curious about those limitations. What are some ways that criminals might try to manipulate or avoid leaving behind DNA evidence?
Well, as criminals become more aware of forensic techniques, they're adapting their methods. They might wear gloves and masks to avoid leaving fingerprints or skin cells. They might be incredibly meticulous about cleaning up a crime scene. And some are even trying to plant DNA from someone else to mislead investigators.
Planting DNA? That sounds like something out of a spy movie. How is that even possible?
It's not as far-fetched as you might think. Imagine a scenario where someone obtains a hairbrush or a used coffee cup from their intended victim. They could then strategically place those items at the crime scene to create a false trail, to cast suspicion on someone else. That's pretty devious. But what about DNA transfer? I've heard about cases where someone's DNA ends up at a crime scene, even though they were never physically there.
What?
How does that happen?
DNA can be transferred through seemingly innocent contact. Let's say you shake hands with someone, right? And then that person later commits a crime. Your DNA could be transferred to their hand during that handshake and subsequently deposited at the crime scene, even though you had absolutely nothing to do with the crime itself.
So it's like this invisible trail that we're leaving everywhere we go. It really highlights the importance of context when it comes to DNA evidence, right?
You're right.
Just because someone's DNA is present at a crime scene doesn't automatically make them guilty.
Exactly. Investigators have to look at the big picture, consider all the possibilities, and not jump to conclusions based on a single piece of evidence.
So it seems like DNA is more of a starting point for investigation, a clue to follow, rather than a definitive answer in every case.
I think that's a good way to put it. Okay, so we've explored the complexities of trying to commit the perfect murder, but what happens when a crime is suspected? How do we even define solved? And what factors influence whether a suspect is actually convicted? Do those statistics we always hear about, the clearance rates and all that, do they really paint an accurate picture?
Those are great questions, and it takes us into the world of the justice system, which can be a very complicated and often, a very messy place. Because even if a crime is technically solved, a suspect is identified, securing a conviction is a whole other battle, one that takes place in courtrooms and is influenced by a whole web of factors.
Yeah, Martin is very critical of those detection rate statistics that we often hear thrown around. He argues that they can be really misleading, because they often just lump arrests together with convictions. They don't always reflect how many cases actually result in someone being held accountable for their actions.
Right, and there's a lot of nuance there that gets lost in the simplification. For example, a case might be considered solved when a suspect is arrested, but what if they're later released due to lack of evidence or procedural errors? Does that really mean the case was successfully resolved?
It seems like there are a lot of gray areas in these statistics, a lot of room for interpretation.
Absolutely. And then you have the issue of plea deals, which is where things get ethically complicated, in my opinion.
How so?
Well, a suspect might agree to plead guilty, right? Maybe to a lesser charge or even confess to other crimes, all in exchange for a reduced sentence. It happens all the time.
So it's like a bargain, a negotiation.
In a way, yes. And while this can make things seem more efficient, help clear cases more quickly, it raises some serious questions about whether justice is truly being served.
It makes you think about the motivations behind those plea deals, both for the prosecution and the defense. Are they always looking for the truth? Or is it sometimes about expediency, about closing cases and moving on?
It's a valid question, and one that I think deserves more attention. And then you have this other uncomfortable truth that Martin points out. The fact that wealth and resources play a big role in how these cases are handled and ultimately resolved.
In what way?
Well, he states that individuals with a lot of money, a lot of resources, are actually 3 to 4 times more likely to avoid conviction for murder compared to those who don't have those advantages.
Wait, are you saying that if you're rich, you're statistically more likely to get away with murder?
That's essentially what the data suggests, yes.
That's incredibly disturbing. It seems like a complete contradiction to the whole principle of justice being blind, of everyone being treated equally under the law.
It's a sobering thought, and it highlights how systemic inequalities can impact every stage of the justice system. Access to experienced lawyers, expert witnesses, the ability to mount a strong and well-funded defense, all of these factors can influence the outcome of a case, regardless of actual guilt or innocence.
So after this deep dive, after exploring all of these complexities, where do we stand on the question of the perfect murder? Is it just a myth, a fantasy for those who think they can escape the consequences of their actions? Or is it a chilling possibility that exists within the shadows of our legal system and the complexities of human nature? It really does feel like the perfect murder, much like this whole idea of perfection in general, is more of a theoretical concept than something you could actually achieve, in the real world.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's this almost mythical thing, this idea that you can commit a crime and just disappear, leave absolutely no trace behind. And it really does highlight this constant push and pull between how advanced our technology is getting and, just how messy and unpredictable human beings can be.
Right. Like we have all these incredible forensic tools, right? We can analyze microscopic traces, recreate digital footprints, but then you have this other side of the coin where it's human error, those impulsive decisions, or even just plain dumb luck that often ends up tripping criminals up.
It's like this never-ending game of cat and mouse. As investigators come up with new ways to catch killers, criminals are constantly adapting, looking for new ways to exploit weaknesses, stay one step ahead.
And then you have to factor in the human element, right? The fact that so many murders are committed by people who are already close to the victim. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to it all.
Absolutely. It's not just about the physical evidence anymore. It's about understanding relationships, motives, the things that drive people to do what they do. It's about psychology as much as it is about science.
There's this really chilling idea that Martin brings up in his book, and it kind of stuck with me. He talks about how the most terrifying crimes are the ones we never even know are crimes. The ones that blend so seamlessly into everyday life that they just become part of the background noise.
It is a chilling thought because it makes you wonder how many of these perfect murders are happening right under our noses. How many are being disguised as accidents, dismissed as something completely mundane, just because there's nothing to make us question it.
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it? It's like this reminder that even with all of our advancements, all of our efforts to make the world a safer and more just place, there will always be those who are operating in the shadows, finding ways to exploit the system, to take advantage of our blind spots.
And I think that's what makes this whole concept of the perfect murder so fascinating, so enduring. Whether it's ultimately possible or not, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, but our capacity for both good and evil.
Well, deep divers, I think we've officially cracked open the case file on the perfect murder. We've explored the myths, the realities, the ethical dilemmas, and honestly, I'm left with more questions than answers.
I think that's a good thing, though.
Yeah.
It means we're thinking critically, we're engaging with the complexity of these issues.
So what's resonating with you the most after this deep dive? Is it the constant evolution of forensic technology? The chilling reality that crimes often hit closer to home than we might think? Or maybe the inherent flaws and biases within the justice system itself?
Whatever it is, we encourage you to keep those questions in mind as you move through the world. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries that surround us. Until next time.